The crystal wine glass felt like ice in Jessica's hand, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation scorching her cheeks. The words, spat from the perfectly glossed lips of her husband's mistress, echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence of the dining room, worthless. One word designed to shatter her. Everyone was looking at her, her weak husband, her stunned mother-in-law, and her terrifyingly calm father-in-law, Stephen Hayes. What would you do if the life you sacrificed everything for was declared worthless right in front of you? For Jessica, that single venomous word wasn't an end. It was a violent, shocking beginning to a story no one, least of all her, could have ever predicted. Life for Jessica Hayes was a masterpiece of curated perfection. From the outside, it was a portrait of enviable success. She was married to Michael Hayes, the charismatic and ambitious heir to Hayes Industries, a sprawling logistics empire built from the ground up by his formidable father, Stephen Hayes. Their home in the exclusive suburb of Oakwood Hills was a testament to their status, a modern glass and steel marvel, with panoramic city views interiors that graced architectural magazines and gardens that bloomed with unnatural precision. Jessica was the quiet, elegant force behind this perfection. She had met Michael in college, a bright-eyed art history major with dreams of curating a museum. He had been a driven business student, handsome and full of promises. When he proposed, he hadn't just offered her a ring, he had offered her a world he'd explained that required a certain kind of partnership. His career would be demanding, his family expectations high. He needed a wife who could manage their world so he could conquer the other one. And Jessica, deeply in love, had agreed. She put her own ambitions in a beautifully wrapped box and stored them in the attic of her mind. She became Mrs. Hayes. Her new career was managing the household staff, orchestrating flawless dinner parties for Michael's business associates, and sitting on the boards of the right charities. She was the perfect accessory to his life, poised, intelligent, and impeccably dressed, ensuring every cog in their domestic machine ran silently and smoothly. But over the last 2 years, the gilded cage had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. The silence in their massive home had grown cavernous. Michael was no longer just working late. He was absent. His phone, once a tool for business, was now a guarded fortress, always angled away from her, buzzing with texts at all hours that he would dismiss with a casual, "just work on." The intimacy had evaporated, replaced by a polite, hollow routine. Kisses were pecks on the cheek in passing. Conversations were logistical exchanges about schedules and social obligations. Jessica felt a creeping invisibility, as if she were slowly fading into the beige silk wallpaper of her own home. She tried to breach the distance, suggesting weekends away, cooking his favorite meals, wearing the dress he once loved. But her efforts were met with a distracted smile and a pat on the hand, as if she were a loyal pet seeking a moment of attention. The loneliness was a physical ache. She would wander through the silent, immaculate rooms of her home, her reflection staring back at her from polished surfaces, a stranger in her own life. She had sacrificed her friends from her old life who didn't quite fit into Michael's world, and the society wives she now associated with were masters of superficiality. Their conversations were a carousel of gossip, renovations, and vacation plans, a language Jessica spoke fluently, but felt no connection to. The Hayes family was an institution in itself. Margaret Hayes, her mother-in-law, was a woman from a generation that believed a wife's duty was to stand by her husband no matter what, and to never ever air dirty laundry in public. She was kind to Jessica, in a formal, distant way, but offered no real warmth or camaraderie. And then there was Stephen. Stephen Hayes was a man carved from granite and ambition. He was in his mid-60s, but possessed an energy that exhausted men half his age. His eyes, a piercing grey, seemed to see everything, to analyze and assess every person and situation, with unnerving accuracy. He rarely spoke in meetings, but when he did, his words carried the weight of law. He was a patriarch in the truest sense of the word, and his approval was the sun around which the entire family orbited. He had always been polite to Jessica, treating her with a detached respect he might afford a valuable, if non-essential, asset. She both feared and admired him, but she never felt she truly knew the man behind the fearsome reputation. The upcoming dinner was particularly important. It was Stephen's 65th birthday, a milestone that demanded a grand yet intimate family celebration. Jessica had been planning it for weeks, a task she approached with the meticulous detail of a military strategist. She'd overseen the menu with their private chef, selected the vintage French wines from their cellar, and arranged the floral centerpieces herself, a small act of personal creativity in a life of delegated tasks. This dinner, she hoped, would be a chance to reconnect. A chance for Michael to see the effort she put in for the family, to feel like a family again, even if just for one night. On the evening of the dinner, as she fastened a simple pearl necklace around her neck, she looked at her reflection. She looked every bit the part of Jessica Hayes, the perfect wife. Her navy blue dress was understated elegance, her makeup flawless. But her eyes held a flicker of desperation. She took a deep breath, pushing down the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was just a family dinner. It would be fine. She would make sure of it. As she walked down the sweeping staircase to greet her in-laws, she had no idea that the foundations of her perfectly constructed world were about to be bulldozed into rubble. The evening began with the strained politeness that had become the hallmark of Hayes family gatherings. Stephen and Margaret arrived precisely at 7. Stephen presented Jessica with a bottle of wine, so rare it was practically a museum piece. His compliment on the home's appearance, both a genuine appreciation and a subtle reminder of her role. "The house looks impeccable, Jessica." "As always." Margaret, draped in cashmere and diamonds, kissed the air beside Jessica's cheek and immediately began a gentle critique of the flower arrangements. "Lilies are a lovely choice, dear, though perhaps a bit funereal for a birthday, don't you think?" Jessica just smiled. "I thought their elegance was fitting for the occasion, Margaret." Michael, for his part, was playing the role of the doting son and husband with practiced ease. He poured his father a glass of 25-year-old Scotch, laughed at a familiar anecdote, and even placed a proprietary hand on the small of Jessica's back as she moved around the living room. It was a performance, and Jessica was his unwilling co-star. She could feel the tension in his touch, the slight tremor that betrayed his anxiety. His phone had been buzzing in his pocket all day, each vibration a small betrayal that only she seemed to notice. They moved into the grand dining room, the table a glittering landscape of polished silver and Waterford crystal. The first course, a delicate seared scallop dish, was served, and the conversation remained in the shallow end of the pool market trends, local politics, Margaret's upcoming charity luncheon. Jessica felt herself receding, becoming a silent observer at her own table, nodding and smiling as required. It was during a lull in the conversation between the scallop course and the main course of roasted duck that the doorbell rang. Its chime cut through the quiet hum of the room with the jarring finality of a gavel. The housekeeper, a discreet woman named Maria, was already moving to answer it, but Michael shot up from his seat, his face suddenly pale. "I'll get it," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Probably just a late delivery." Stephen's grey eyes narrowed slightly, a barely perceptible shift. He stopped his wine glass halfway to his lips and watched his son hurry from the room. Jessica's heart began to hammer against her ribs. A cold dread, sharp and specific, washed over her. This was it. The vague anxiety she'd been living with for months was about to be given a name and a face. They could hear muffled, urgent whispers from the foyer. Michael's voice was strained, pleading. It was answered by a woman's voice, low but firm, with a cutting edge of indignation. Then the sound of heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. Michael re-entered the dining room, his face ashen. Following behind him was a woman who seemed to suck all the air out of the room. She was stunning in a way that was almost aggressive, tall and statuesque, poured into a blood-red dress that clung to every curve. Her long dark hair was styled in sleek, severe lines, and her makeup was a work of art. She was the polar opposite of Jessica's classic elegance. She was a declaration of war. She paused at the entrance to the dining room, her eyes sweeping over the scene with an expression of triumphant ownership. Her gaze landed on Jessica and lingered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of cold assessment in her dark eyes. "Michael, darling," the woman said, her voice smooth as velvet but laced with steel. "Aren't you going to introduce me?" Michael looked like a cornered animal. He stammered, This is Brenda. Brenda Walsh. She's a colleague from the marketing firm we're consulting with." The lie was so flimsy, so pathetic, it was almost laughable. Brenda's smile was a predatory slash of red. Stephen Hayes said nothing. He simply placed his wine glass down with a soft, deliberate click. He looked from his son's panicked face to the defiant woman in the red dress, and then for a long, unbearable moment, his unreadable gaze settled on Jessica. In that moment, she felt more exposed than if she'd been naked. He wasn't just looking at her. He was dissecting her reaction, judging her composure under fire. Margaret gasped softly, her hand flying to her pearls. "Michael, what is the meaning of this?" Brenda ignored her completely. She walked further into the room as if she owned it. Her eyes locked on Jessica. "Oh, I think we can all be a bit more honest than that." She purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Brenda. I'm the woman your husband actually loves." She stopped right beside the table, her presence an invasive, cloying perfume in the air. "And you," she said, looking directly at Jessica, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cruel whisper meant for the entire table to hear, "must be the wife." The silence that followed Brenda's pronouncement was a physical entity. It pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating. Jessica felt as if she were underwater, the sounds of the room distant and distorted. Her husband's affair, the secret she had suspected but had been too afraid to confirm, was now a guest at their dinner table, wearing a red dress and a smirk. Michael, utterly neutered, could only sputter. "Brenda, this is not the time or the place." "Oh, but it is." Brenda countered, her voice sharp. She didn't even look at him. Her entire focus was a laser beam aimed at Jessica. "I think this is the perfect time, the time for secrets to end. I'm tired of being relegated to stolen weekends and hushed phone calls. I'm tired of you pretending to be happy in this museum." She gestured around the opulent dining room with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Jessica's hands were clenched into fists in her lap, her manicured nails digging into her palms. The pain was a welcome anchor in the swirling vortex of humiliation. She forced herself to meet Brenda's gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of looking away. She would not cry. Not here. Margaret, recovering from her initial shock, found her voice. "Young lady, you have no right to be in this house. This is a private family dinner." Brenda finally turned her head to acknowledge her mother-in-law, a slow, insolent movement. "With all due respect, Margaret, this is my family dinner now, too. Or it will be. Michael and I are in love. He's just been trying to find the right way to tell you all." She reached out and placed a perfectly manicured hand on Michael's shoulder. He flinched but didn't pull away. That simple, damning inaction was a stab to Jessica's heart. What I can't understand, Brenda continued her tone, shifting to one of mock sympathy as she turned back to Jessica, is why it's taken him so long. I mean, what is there to even hold on to here? Her eyes roamed over Jessica from her simple pearl necklace to her conservative dress, her gaze lingering with open contempt. You don't work. You don't have a career. You don't bring anything to the table except floral arrangements. She laughed, a short, ugly sound. Michael is a shark, a titan of industry. He needs a partner, an equal, someone who understands his world, who can challenge him and build an empire with him. Every word was a carefully chosen dart, dipped in the poison of Jessica's deepest insecurities. The career she'd given up, the intellectual life she'd let wither, the nagging feeling that she had become nothing more than a high-class housekeeper. Jessica felt a tremor start in her hands. She wanted to scream, to throw her wine in this woman's smug face, to claw that look of triumph from her eyes. But she was frozen, trapped by years of conditioned poise and the paralyzing presence of her father-in-law, who still hadn't said a single word. He just watched his face, an impenetrable mask. Seeing her silence, Brenda moved in for the kill. She leaned forward slightly, placing her hands on the back of an empty chair as if she were already claiming her seat at the table. "He told me all about you," she said, her voice dropping to a low, vicious murmur that carried across the silent room. "How you're nice. How you're a good manager of the house. But there's no passion, no fire. You're just a placeholder. A decorative, beautiful, and utterly worthless placeholder." Worthless. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. It echoed in the pristine dining room, a piece of graffiti scrawled across a masterpiece. Jessica's breath hitched, the blood drained from her face, and for a terrifying second she thought she might faint. The room swam before her eyes. She looked at Michael, a desperate, pleading glance. "Say something. Defend me. Defend our life, our marriage, the years I have given you." But Michael just stood there, his mouth slightly agape, a portrait of pathetic cowardice. He looked from Brenda to his father, his eyes wide with fear, completely incapable of action. His silence was his answer. It was his agreement. In that moment, something inside Jessica snapped. The years of quiet sacrifice, of swallowing her pride, of politely smiling through the loneliness, it all curdled into a cold, hard knot of fury in her stomach. The shock and humiliation began to recede, replaced by a glacial rage. The spell of silence was finally broken, not by Jessica or Michael, but by the quiet, deliberate sound of a fork being placed on a plate. It was Stephen. He had calmly set down his silverware, the clink of metal on porcelain as loud as a gunshot. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin, folded it precisely, and placed it on the table. Then slowly he lifted his gaze. He didn't look at Brenda. He didn't look at Jessica. He looked at his son. And for the first time that night, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it held a chilling, absolute authority that made every other sound in the world cease to exist. "Michael," he said, his voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Explain yourself." All eyes snapped to Michael. Under his father's glacial gaze, he seemed to shrink, the last vestiges of his bravado evaporating. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a schoolboy caught cheating on a final exam, utterly exposed and without defense. Dad, it's complicated." He finally managed to stammer, his voice thin and reedy. Stephen Hayes let out a short, mirthless puff of air that wasn't quite a laugh. "Complicated," He repeated the word, tasting like an insult on his tongue. No, Michael, it isn't. It is, in fact, painfully simple. He still hadn't looked at Brenda, who stood frozen, her triumphant smirk beginning to falter. She had expected a shouting match, tears, a dramatic family implosion. She had not expected this cold, clinical dissection. Stephen slowly rose from his chair. He wasn't a tall man, but his presence was immense, filling the room with an aura of raw, controlled power. He began to walk slowly around the table, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. For 35 years, Stephen began, his voice a low, menacing rumble, I have built a company, not just a company, an empire, and I did not build it on flashy deals or clever marketing. I built it on one principle above all others: integrity. Your word is your bond. Loyalty is not a currency to be spent. It is the bedrock upon which everything is built. He stopped behind Michael's chair, placing a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. Michael flinched, as if he'd been burned. I have given you everything. Stephen continued, his voice dangerously soft. The best education. A position of power you didn't earn. A life of luxury you have never had to struggle for. And in return, I asked for very little. I asked you to be a Hayes, to understand the weight of that name. And what do? He squeezed Michael's shoulder hard. You bring this instability, this lack of judgment into my house, on my birthday. He finally turned his gaze to Brenda. She visibly recoiled, her bravado shattering under the force of his contempt. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the dispassionate air of a man examining a flawed piece of merchandise. You, he said, his voice flat. You think you are a shark. You think you have won some great prize. He gestured vaguely at Michael. You have attached yourself to this. A boy playing at being a man. A boy who lacks the fundamental courage to end one relationship before beginning another. A boy who would allow his wife, the mother of his future children, to be humiliated in his own home. He took a step closer to her. You are not a partner. You are a liability, a miscalculation. You think this is about love, about passion. This is a business transaction. And you, Ms. Walsh, have proven yourself to be a very, very poor investment. Brenda's face, once a mask of smug confidence, was now a crumbling facade of shock and fury. You have no right. I have every right. Stephen cut her off, his voice slicing through hers like a razor. This is my legacy, my family, my house. You are an intruder who has fundamentally misread the situation. You saw weakness in my son, and you thought that was the keys to the kingdom. You failed to realize that the weakness you exploited is the very thing that makes him worthless to me. He turned back to Michael, his voice, dropping even lower, filled with a chilling finality. The trust fund your grandfather set up for you will be frozen effective tomorrow morning. Your company credit cards will be cancelled. Security will meet you at your office on Monday to escort you from the premises. You are relieved of your duties at Hayes Industries. Michael gasped, his face a mask of disbelief. Dad, you can't. The Anderson merger, I'm leading that. You are leading nothing, Stephen stated, as if discussing the weather. You are a disgrace. You have disgraced your name, your mother, and your wife. He then did the most unexpected thing of all. He turned his full attention to Jessica. Her own shock was so profound, she could barely breathe. She had been a spectator to her own execution, and now the executioner was looking at her. His grey eyes, for the first time, held something other than detached assessment. It was a flicker of respect. Jessica, he said, his voice, now devoid of its earlier menace, calm and clear. This woman called you worthless. He paused, letting the word hang in the air again, but this time it had lost its power. He had stripped it of its venom. My son's choices have proven that he is the one who does not understand value. He has mistaken flash for substance. He has traded gold for brass. He looked from Jessica to his whimpering son, and to the stunned mistress. Michael, you and Miss Walsh will leave my home now. But my things, Michael protested weakly. You will be allowed to collect your personal effects at a time of Jessica's choosing, not before, Stephen commanded. Then came the final devastating blow that realigned the entire universe. He looked back at Jessica, who was still seated, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, unbelievable hope. Stephen Hayes, the formidable patriarch who had never offered her more than polite civility, gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Jessica, he said, his voice firm and resolute, you will stay. This is your home. The sound of the heavy front door closing behind Michael and Brenda was a deafening boom in the silent house. It was the sound of a life ending. Jessica sat at the dining table, a lone survivor in the wreckage of her marriage, the exquisite duck confit growing cold on the fine china. Margaret was weeping softly, dabbing at her eyes with a linen napkin. Stephen, how could he, in our own home, in front of us? Stephen ignored her. He walked back to his seat at the head of the table and sat down. He picked up his wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. For a long moment, the only sounds were Margaret's quiet sobs and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jessica felt 1,000 emotions, at once relief so profound it felt like pain, a terrifying uncertainty about the future, and a strange, fragile sense of vindication. She looked at the man at the end of the table. She had been married into his family for 8 years, and she realized in that moment that she had never known him at all. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and measured, as if the preceding thermonuclear event had been a minor inconvenience. Jessica. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. Yes. Her own voice was a hoarse whisper. I imagine you have questions. It was the understatement of the century. A few. She managed to say, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. He nodded. Firstly, I apologize. Not for Michael's behavior. He is a man, and he is responsible for his own failings. I apologize that you were subjected to that scene in this house. It was a failure of our family's standards. This formal, almost corporate apology was so quintessentially Stephen that it almost broke the tension. You fired him. Jessica stated the reality of it, still sinking in. You cut him off completely. I did, Stephen confirmed, swirling the deep red wine in his glass. Hayes Industries was not built to be a playground for spoiled children. It was built on strength, foresight, and unwavering reliability. Michael has demonstrated a catastrophic lack of all three. A man who cannot manage his own household cannot be trusted to manage a $100 million merger. His disloyalty to you was not a personal failing. It was a character flaw. And character flaws are liabilities I do not tolerate in my business. Jessica stared at him, beginning to understand. This wasn't just about a cheating husband. To Stephen, this was a business problem. Michael's affair was a symptom of a deeper rot, poor judgment, a lack of discipline, a preference for short-term gratification over long-term stability. He had assessed his son and found him to be a bad investment. Did you know? Jessica asked the question, escaping her before she could stop it. About the affair. Stephen met her eyes without flinching. I have known for 6 months that Michael was careless with company funds, that he was taking business trips to resorts with a marketing consultant. I did not know her name, nor did I care to. I was observing. I was waiting to see if my son had the character to rectify his own mistakes. I gave him enough rope to see what he would do with it. Tonight, he chose to hang himself. The cold pragmatism of it was staggering. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. He had been watching, waiting, testing. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. "To me?" This was the question that had been screaming in her mind. Was she just another asset to be liquidated in the fallout? A problem to be handled with a generous but dismissive divorce settlement? Stephen set his glass down. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and fixed her with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. "That, Jessica, is entirely up to you," he said. "Option 1 is simple, clean, and what most people would expect. My lawyers will draft a divorce settlement, so generous that you will never have to worry about money again for the rest of your life. You can have this house as stipend, anything you require. You can go back to your art, travel the world, and forget the name Hayes ever existed." It was a tempting offer, a golden parachute from a life that had brought her so much pain. But as he spoke, she felt a surprising pang of dissatisfaction. To take the money and run felt like accepting Brenda's verdict. It felt like admitting she was nothing without a man's name and fortune. "And option 2, she asked, her voice gaining a bit of strength. A flicker of something approval, perhaps, danced in Stephen's eyes. "Option 2 is more complicated. For years I have watched you. You manage this household with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 COO. You navigate complex social hierarchies with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. You have a degree in art history, an eye for detail, and an intellect that my son was too foolish to ever engage." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Hayes Industries has a philanthropic arm, the Hayes Foundation. It's been run by my sister for 20 years, and frankly, it's become stagnant. It's a tax write-off, a PR tool. It has no vision, no soul." He leaned back in his chair. "I am offering you a position, Executive Director of the Hayes Foundation. You will have a budget, a staff, and complete autonomy. Your mandate will be to rebuild it from the ground up. Turn it into something that has a real measurable impact, something that reflects the values this family is supposed to stand for." Jessica was speechless. Her mind reeled. A job, not a charity position, not a hobby, but a real, powerful, demanding job. It was the life she had packed away in a box all those years ago, being handed back to her by the most intimidating man she had ever known. "Why?" she finally breathed. "Why would you offer me that?" Stephen looked at her, and the granite facade seemed to crack for just a moment, revealing the man beneath. "Because, Jessica, true loyalty is the rarest and most valuable commodity in the world. You have shown it to my family even when my son did not deserve it. I do not discard assets like that. I reinvest in them." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "You don't have to decide now. Take the weekend. Think about what you want your life to look like. Maria will show you to the master guest suite. I've had it prepared for you. Michael's things will be removed from the master bedroom tomorrow." As he and a still sniffling Margaret left the dining room, Jessica remained seated amid the ruins of her birthday dinner. The choice he had given her was stark, a quiet, comfortable ending, or a difficult, terrifying new beginning. For the first time in a very long time, the future was not a pre-written script. It was a blank page, and the pen was finally in her hand. Jessica didn't take the weekend. She called Stephen's personal assistant at 9 a.m. the next morning and accepted the position. A wave of fear and exhilaration washed over her as she hung up the phone. She had spent the night in the vast, silent guest suite, staring at the ceiling, feeling the tectonic plates of her life shift beneath her. Taking the money felt like a retreat. Taking the job felt like a declaration of war, not on Michael or Brenda, but on the version of herself who had allowed her own worth to be dictated by others. The first few weeks were a trial by fire. The Hayes Foundation office was a sleepy, neglected corner of the Hayes Industries corporate tower. The staff were polite, but skeptical, viewing her as the boss's cast-off daughter-in-law, given a vanity project to keep her busy. The files were a mess of outdated projects and uninspired check writing to the same handful of politically safe charities year after year. Jessica dove in. She worked 12-hour days, fueled by coffee and a burning need to prove herself. She read every file, every financial report, every grant proposal from the last decade. She met with community leaders, non-profit organizers, and activists, people from a world far removed from the society luncheons she used to attend. She listened. Slowly she began to form a vision. Instead of just writing checks, the foundation would become an active partner. She proposed a new flagship initiative, Project Catalyst, which would provide seed funding and, more importantly, business mentorship from Hayes Industries executives to women and minority-owned startups focused on sustainable technology. When she presented the plan to Stephen, she was terrified. She laid out her vision, her budget projections, and her expected outcomes in a formal boardroom presentation. He sat at the far end of the long table, listening without expression, his face an unreadable mask. When she finished, the silence stretched for an eternity. "It's aggressive," he said finally. "It's risky. The old guard on the board will hate it." Jessica's heart sank. "Good." He added, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "It's about time someone shook things up. The budget is approved. Run with it." That approval was the spark that lit the fire. Jessica transformed. The quiet, accommodating Mrs. Hayes was shed like a skin. In her place was Ms. Jessica Croft. She had started using her maiden name professionally, the driven, incisive director of the Hayes Foundation. Her wardrobe of soft pastels was replaced with sharp blazers and power dresses. Her hesitant suggestions became confident directives. Her work became her life, but unlike her old life, it energized rather than drained her. She discovered she had a talent for seeing potential, where others saw problems, for connecting people, for turning abstract ideas into concrete results. For the first time since college, she felt intellectually alive. She felt valuable. Meanwhile, Michael's world was collapsing in a slow, agonizing implosion. The stories filtered back to her through office gossip and the occasional reluctant update from Margaret. Being fired by his own father was the ultimate humiliation. His name, once a golden ticket, was now an anchor. No reputable company would touch him, fearing the wrath of Stephen Hayes. Brenda, true to Stephen's prediction, had vanished the moment the money dried up. The passionate, all-consuming love she'd professed was, as it turned out, directly correlated to Michael's Amex Black Card limit. She left him with a mountain of debt from their lavish trips and a scathing parting text message. Stripped of his job, his money, and his mistress Michael was forced to sell his sports car and move into a small, generic apartment downtown. He tried calling Jessica at first, with angry, entitled demands, then with pathetic, pleading voicemails. She instructed her assistant to block his number. The divorce was swift and clinical. On the day it was finalized, Jessica felt not sadness, but a profound sense of not just of her life, but of who she was. 6 months after that fateful dinner, Jessica stood on a stage at the Project Catalyst launch event. The room was filled with journalists, city officials, and the first cohort of bright, ambitious entrepreneurs her foundation was funding. She looked out at the crowd, confident and poised, speaking passionately about the power of opportunity and innovation. In the back of the room, standing quietly, was Stephen Hayes. He wasn't there as the CEO of Hayes Industries, but simply as an observer. As Jessica finished her speech to a thunderous round of applause, their eyes met across the crowded room. He gave her a single definitive nod. It wasn't a nod of approval from a father-in-law to a daughter-in-law. It was a nod of respect from one professional to another, an acknowledgement from one architect to another. He had given her the rubble and the blueprints, but she, Jessica Croft, was the one building the empire. A year to the day after the dinner party that had detonated her life, Jessica was working late, poring over quarterly reports for the foundation. Project Catalyst had become a resounding success, exceeding all its first-year projections. It was the talk of the city's philanthropic and business circles. Jessica was no longer known as Michael Hayes' ex-wife. She was Jessica Croft, the visionary leader, who had resurrected the Hayes Foundation. Her office, once a corporate afterthought, was now a vibrant hub of activity, with walls covered in project plans and photos of the entrepreneurs they supported. It was a space that reflected her organized, dynamic, and full of purpose. Her intercom buzzed. "Ms. Croft," her assistant's voice said, sounding hesitant. "There's a Michael Hayes here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's insistent." Jessica's fingers stilled on her keyboard. A cold knot formed in her stomach, but it was a knot of annoyance, not fear. "It's all right, Sarah. Send him in." The man who walked through her office door was a ghost. The old Michael, tanned, tailored, and radiating an effortless arrogance, was gone. This Michael was thin, his expensive suit looked rumpled, and a size too big, and his eyes were hollowed out with desperation. He looked like a man who had been adrift for a very long time. He stopped in the middle of her office, looking around at the unfamiliar space at her. "Jess," he said, his voice raspy, "you look amazing. What do you want, Michael?" She asked, her tone polite but firm. There was no anger left, only a vast, empty distance. "I wanted to see you. To talk," he said, taking a hesitant step forward. "I've had a lot of time to think this past year. About everything. About what I did. What I lost." He gestured around her office. "My father. He gave you this. My job. Your father gave me an opportunity." Jessica corrected him coolly. "I built this. This wasn't yours to have, Michael. You wouldn't have known what to do with it." The truth of her words seemed to hit him. He deflated the last of his resentment, draining away, leaving only a pathetic sorrow. "You're right," he whispered. "I see that now. I was a fool, Jess. I was an idiot who didn't know what he had. She meant nothing. Brenda, it was all just an escape, an ego trip. It wasn't real. It was real enough to call me worthless in front of your family," Jessica reminded him, not out of spite, but as a statement of fact. He flinched, the memory still raw. "I know. And I let her. God, I hate myself for that every single day. I should have defended you. I should have thrown her out on the street." His eyes filled with tears. "I miss you, Jess. I miss our life. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for another chance. I can change. I can be the man you deserve." A year ago, those words might have broken her heart. A year ago, a part of her might have yearned to believe him. But the woman he was speaking to no longer existed. He was proposing to a memory. Jessica slowly stood up and walked around her desk, stopping a safe distance from him. "No, Michael," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "You can't have another chance with me. And you're right, you don't deserve one. But that's not the reason." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt a strange, detached pity. "The woman you're asking for is gone. You and your father and Brenda, you all helped to kill her that night. You broke her. But from those broken pieces I built someone new, someone stronger, someone who doesn't need your validation to know her own worth." She walked to the door and held it open. "I wish you well, Michael. I truly hope you find a way to build a better life for yourself. But it won't be with me. My life is here now." He stared at her for a long moment, the finality of her words washing over him. He saw it in her eyes, the steel, the confidence, the unbreachable self-possession. She was a stranger to him now. Defeated, he turned and walked out of her office and out of her life for good. Jessica closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep, steadying breath. There was no triumph, only a quiet, profound closure. The ghost had been faced and dismissed. Later that evening she had dinner with Stephen. It had become a weekly ritual, a meeting of minds. They rarely spoke of Michael or the past. They talked about the foundation, about the market, about politics and art. He had become her mentor, her champion, and in the most unexpected way, the truest family she had ever known. As they sat across from each other, raising their glasses in a silent toast, Jessica looked at the man who had in one night both destroyed her world and given her the tools to build a new one. She had once been defined by the name Hayes, a name she had taken in marriage. Now she had forged her own name, one built not on inheritance or association, but on her own resilience, her own intellect, and her own undeniable worth. And that was a foundation that no one could ever shatter. 2 years passed. In that time, Jessica Croft didn't just run the Hayes Foundation. She turned it into a powerhouse of social innovation. Project Catalyst had become a nationally recognized incubator, and Jessica herself had become a prominent and respected voice in the city. She sat on civic boards, gave keynote speeches, and was featured in business magazines, not as a socialite, but as a strategist and a leader. Her past life as Mrs. Michael Hayes felt like a story she had read about someone else. Her relationship with Stephen had evolved into a deep and mutually respectful partnership. Their weekly dinners were less about mentorship and more a council of peers. He valued her perspective, her ability to see the human element in a balance sheet, a skill he admitted his own world often overlooked. He saw in her the successor he had always wanted, but never had in his own son someone with vision grit and an unimpeachable core of integrity. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jessica was summoned to the main corporate boardroom on the 50th floor of the Hayes Tower. This was unusual. Her foundation meetings were typically held in her own offices. When she arrived, she found not just Stephen, but the entire executive board assembled, a collection of grim-faced, silver-haired men who had been with Hayes Industries for decades. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled condescension as she took the single empty seat beside Stephen at the head of the table. Stephen Hayes, now approaching 70, looked as formidable as ever, but Jessica could see the subtle signs of age in the slight slump of his shoulders and the weariness around his eyes. He commanded the room to silence with a simple clearing of his throat. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice still a resonant baritone, "I have called this meeting to discuss the future. As you know, I have no intention of dying at this desk, and the time has come to formalize a succession plan." A ripple of anticipation went through the room. The COO, a bulldog of a man named Frank Gallagher, leaned forward slightly, barely containing his ambition. He was the obvious heir apparent. "The board has urged me to name a successor from within this room." Stephen continued, his eyes sweeping over the expectant faces. "But I have concluded that what has brought us to this point is not what will carry us into the next decade. We have become too comfortable, too insular. We need a new perspective." He paused, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. "Therefore, I am creating a new position, effective immediately, Chief Strategy Officer. This individual will report directly to me and will have oversight on all new acquisitions, market expansion, and long-term strategic planning. This role will serve as the final proving ground for the next CEO of Hayes Industries. The men around the table held their breath. Stephen turned his gaze not to his COO, not to any of his seasoned vice presidents, but directly to Jessica. "And I am offering the position to Jessica Croft." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Then it was broken by a disbelieving scoff from Frank Gallagher. The other men stared their faces, a mixture of shock and outrage. They saw the ex-wife of the family disgrace the head of the soft charity division, being offered the keys to the kingdom. Jessica herself was stunned into silence. She felt the blood drain from her face. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. It was an honor so immense, it was terrifying, a challenge so great, it felt like an attack. Before she could even process it, Stephen concluded the meeting. "My decision is final. You will all give Ms. Croft your complete and total cooperation. That is all." He stood, and the board members, their faces, like thunderclouds, had no choice but to follow suit, filing out of the room with resentful sideways glances at Jessica. The news spread through the corporate world and the Hayes family like a shockwave. That evening, Jessica received a frantic call from Margaret. They met in the quiet, formal living room of the old Hayes mansion, the same house where Jessica's life had once shattered. Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed, her composure gone. "Jessica, you cannot do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I know my son was a fool. He broke my heart, and he broke yours. But this is his birthright, to have his place, his legacy taken by—" She trailed off, unable to say the words. "By his ex-wife," Jessica finished softly, a sad ache in her chest. "This is a man's world, Jessica. The boardroom. Those men will eat you alive." Margaret continued, her worldview from a bygone era laid bare. "It's not right. You have your foundation, your success. Why do you need to take this too? It is the last thing that belongs to Michael's name." Jessica looked at the woman who had once been her mother-in-law. She saw not a villain, but a mother, grieving for the son she had lost, not to death, but to his own weakness. "Margaret," she said gently but firmly, "this has nothing to do with Michael. And it is not being given to me. It is an opportunity I have earned." The conversation ended with tears and a new, painful chasm between them. Troubled, Jessica went to see Stephen in his study. "They will fight me every step of the way," she told him, standing before his massive oak desk. "The board thinks I'm a joke. Margaret thinks I'm a usurper. Why would you put me in this position?" Stephen leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Because I'm not interested in who has the right name. I am interested in who has the right character. For 2 years you have taken a neglected sentimental asset and turned it into a profitable strategic powerhouse that has elevated the Hayes brand more than any marketing campaign ever could. You have faced skepticism and quietly, methodically proven every single critic wrong." He leaned forward, his grey eyes locking onto hers, the full force of his conviction behind his words. "Do not mistake this for a gift, Jessica. It is a burden. I am not giving you a crown. I am pointing you toward an empty throne and inviting you to fight for it. Those men in the boardroom are sharks who have smelled blood in the water for years. Defeating them will be the final test. The question is not why I am putting you in this position. The question is, do you have the will to take what is being offered?" Jessica stood there, the weight of his words of the future settling onto her shoulders. She thought of the woman who had sat at a dinner table, branded worthless. She thought of the fear and the uncertainty, and the spark of rage that had refused to be extinguished. She had not survived all of that, just to retreat when the ultimate challenge presented itself. A slow, determined smile touched her lips. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I do." Her new war had just begun. Jessica's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes our lowest moments are not an ending, but a violent and necessary catalyst for change. It proves that our value is never determined by someone else's opinion, but by our own courage to redefine our lives, even from the ashes of betrayal. She found an unexpected ally in the one person she feared most, and in doing so, discovered the strength she possessed all along. If Jessica's journey from a life of quiet sacrifice to one of powerful self-determination resonated with you, please show your support by hitting someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to build a new foundation. And don't forget to more real-life stories. Below, let us know. What do you think was Stephen Hayes's true motivation? Was it family loyalty or cold, hard business? We'd love to hear your thoughts.